I recently took on a new roommate. The whole situation was unexpected, but I needed help covering rent. I decided to post an ad on Craigslist and managed to find someone within just a week. His name was Dan, and he shared that he had unusual sleep behaviors. He said he regularly experienced sleep talking, sleepwalking, and even night terrors. Oddly enough, I also had a history of sleepwalking, but it only happened on rare occasions. About a week later, the first incident occurred. I heard him screaming in the middle of the night. Since we slept in separate rooms on opposite sides of the house, the screams were distant but alarming enough to make me run to check on him. As I approached his room, he abruptly stopped screaming, so I returned to bed. For the next month, there were no issues. I noticed Dan didn't have any friends or family visiting, and I never saw or heard him on the phone. Then one night, he started screaming again. Just as before, I got up to go check on him, but he stopped by the time I reached his door. One night, I was jolted awake by a scream. It's in my own room this time. In the dark panic, I turned on my bedside lamp and saw him standing at the foot of my bed. He was wearing sleep clothes and a blank expression on his face. Terrified, I started screaming myself, which woke him up. He seemed confused for a moment. He apologized and went back to his room. The most disturbing incident happened soon after. I woke up to strange clanking noises, like tools and light hammering. When I switched on my light, I saw Dan kneeling in a corner. He was working on something with his hands. He froze as soon as the light came on, and he then slowly turned to stare at me with an empty expression. Utterly unsettled, I slipped out of bed and quietly left the house. I spent the rest of the night sleeping in my truck parked down the road at an empty church lot. When I returned to the house around 8 a.m., Dan was gone. All of his things were gone too, leaving no trace of him. Since he hadn't mentioned any friends or family, I had no one to contact. Time passed and soon months had gone by. When I moved out at the end of the lease, I found something unsettling while clearing out my bedroom. In the corner where I'd last seen Dan kneeling, the floor vent was slightly loose. Inside it was an envelope containing photos of me sleeping, with handwritten dates and times on the back. The only other item was a worn-down broom handle, sharpened to a point. I believe Dan had been preparing to harm me that night, but became aware of what he'd almost done. Perhaps he realized his sleepwalking self was a threat, and leaving was his way of protecting me. It seemed he'd been visiting my room almost every night, working on that sharpened handle while I slept. I didn't realize until that final night. During university, a friend's dad bought a house for him and his brother to live in. I moved in along with another friend, but there were still 2 rooms vacant. To fill them, they posted an ad on Craigslist and one random guy took one of the rooms. Let's call him John. He moved his belongings one early morning around 5 a.m., which struck us as unusual right from the start. He wasn't a student at our university. He had moved to the city to be with his girlfriend who was studying there. Sadly for him, his girlfriend broke up with him just a few weeks after he signed the lease. From the beginning, he was a peculiar guy. Hygiene didn't seem to be a priority for him, as he was the filthiest person I had ever met. I once saw him come home from his factory job. His hands were blackened with grease, but he proceeded to make and eat a sandwich without washing up first. We all thought it was pretty revolting, especially with a sink and soap right there in the kitchen. Over time, though, he started blending in more, maybe because he came out to parties with us fairly often. He became known for staying at the bar until closing and occasionally bringing home some woman he'd met that night. Surprisingly, this became a regular pattern for him. Things took a strange turn eventually. He developed a rash, which I thought might be due to the poor condition of his room. There could have been bugs living in there for all we knew, but he had his own theory. He suspected we'd been putting chemicals in his laundry soap to give him that rash. Of course, that was outrageous and completely false. His paranoia only escalated. When he misplaced his driver's license, he was convinced that we'd stolen it to prevent him from coming to the bar with us. Naturally, this wasn't true either. After a few weeks of observing his growing paranoia, an incident occurred that took things to a whole new level. One early morning, I was woken up by someone sprinting up and down the stairs. Half asleep, I assumed one of my roommates was rushing off to an early class. The frantic running continued, then I heard my other roommate shout, "Let's call him Steve." I jumped out of bed and rushed to the kitchen. I found Steve standing there and looking wide-eyed. Around the corner, I saw John standing by the fridge. John was wearing a bathrobe, a pair of clearly women's sweatpants that were way too tight, and a baseball cap with a wolf on it. He had ripped open our fridge and smashed all of our food. Milk, pickles, chili, and everything else were on the floor. When Steve asked him what he was doing, John told us he had taken 11 Benadryl pills. He's visibly shivering and sweating. Unsure how to respond, we led him to the living room and tried to calm him down. He continued to tremble and fix us with a truly unsettling look. At this point, our other slower-reacting roommate emerged to see what was happening. The moment he walked into the living room, John glared at him. He then pointed and shouted, "That's my guy." I'm sure my friend still has nightmares about that look. While we were trying to figure out what to do, John suddenly sprang to his feet. He let out a yell and charged at Steve. Luckily, Steve had worked as a bouncer and he instinctively hip-tossed John through a dining room chair. We tackled him together and held him down, despite his wild kicks and punches. While he struggled, he started shouting nonsensical things. One line stuck out to me. He kept on shouting that the media always wins. We held him down for as long as we could while trying to figure out the next step. Finally, we called 911. The police and medics soon arrived to take him to the hospital. Curiosity got the better of us once he was taken away, and we peeked into his room to try to understand what had been going on. We found a bunch of our food stashed away, a nearly empty bottle of Tylenol, and some Benadryl scattered on the floor. There was also a box with an old photo album and other keepsakes. These seemed to be mementos from his relationship with his ex. It seemed likely that his hat was a gift from her, and the sweatpants he wore that morning were probably hers too. But that wasn't the strangest discovery. As we were holding him down earlier, his small sweatpants began to slide down. It revealed that he was wearing a pair of purple women's underwear. We could only assume these also had once belonged to his ex. It looked like he had attempted to overdose on pills. Instead of passing out, he'd ended up on a bizarre, distressing trip. We only saw him one more time, when he came by briefly to pick up his things and move out. He didn't say much and clearly wanted to avoid the topic entirely. The story took place in 2006. I had recently moved into a new apartment with a roommate I'd met on Craigslist. For context, both of us were male. I was 20 and he was around 24. Our apartment was located in a relatively nice part of Chicago, in a neighborhood primarily populated by elderly people of Eastern European descent. Within my 6 months of living there, I encountered several bizarre incidents. Once, a robber on the run from the police attempted to use our rooftop as a hiding spot. Another time, an eccentric older woman wandered straight into our apartment, sat down on the couch, and then refused to leave. My version of an alarm clock was a homeless man who appeared to struggle with mental health issues. He would stand outside below my second-story window each morning at 8 a.m. sharp. Then he would scream at the top of his lungs for anywhere between 10 to 15 minutes. There were no words, just raw guttural screams. To make things even stranger, my psychology major roommate appeared to have some dark tendencies. A few years after moving out, I ran into his ex-boyfriend. He's an incredibly kind guy who told me that my former roommate had once tried to run him and their dog over with his car. But that's a story for another time. This particular story focuses not on my roommate, but on our peculiar neighbors who lived downstairs. I occasionally saw them in passing. They were a man and a woman, both of Eastern European descent. The man seemed to be in his 20s and the woman in her mid-50s. At first, I assumed they were mother and son until one day I noticed them holding hands and being affectionate, which clued me into the fact that they were in fact a couple. Every time I saw them, they seemed to be carrying massive pieces of wood into their apartment. Sometimes it was large sheets of plywood, and other times it was heavy wooden furniture like long dining tables. The constant noise from below started to drive my roommate and me up the wall. Day and night, we heard hammers, power drills, and the sounds of multiple people talking and moving around. I figured they must be remodeling their apartment and hoped the racket would eventually stop. Occasionally, I noticed other people entering and leaving their apartment. I just assumed they were part of the work crew. Looking back, I don't know why I didn't just call the landlord. Being new to apartment living, I probably didn't want the hassle of dealing with it, nor did I want to risk any backlash if they found out I'd complained. I also thought maybe one of the other neighbors would handle it instead, saving me the trouble. Then one early evening, I was relishing a rare moment of peace. I curled up in bed with a good book, enjoying the silence. Then suddenly, I heard a man shouting outside. He was screaming that someone had a knife and was trying to kill him. Jumping out of bed, I rushed to the door to see what was happening. The younger man from downstairs came sprinting out of his apartment at full speed. He was shouting for help as he ran down the street until he was out of sight. The police arrived a few minutes later, arrested the older woman, and began their investigation. That got me really curious. I wandered downstairs where a few other neighbors had gathered, all trying to piece together what had just happened. The door to the couple's apartment was wide open. From a distance, I could see that their living room had been transformed into a massive wooden cubby structure. Imagine those compartmental bookshelves you see in stores. However, each compartment was large enough to hold a person. The whole room had been taken over by this structure, with cubby-like spaces arranged lengthwise. It's very similar to the morgue storage units for bodies. The police weren't sharing any details with the neighbors, but I had a decent rapport with the landlord. A few weeks later, I managed to pry some information out of her. Reluctantly, she revealed that the couple had been building these cubby spaces to house undocumented immigrants. They were essentially renting out these cubby spaces as beds in exchange for rent. Apparently, the couple had gotten into a heated argument on the night of the incident. The man had threatened to reveal their operation. In retaliation, the woman had supposedly grabbed a knife, possibly intending to silence him permanently. Luckily, he managed to escape before she could harm him. After everything that had happened in just 6 months, I decided it was time to leave. I ended up staying on a friend's couch for a couple of months until I found a place of my own. I was searching online for any sort of gig that paid, not really picky about what kind. After some time scrolling, I refreshed the page and a new post popped up on Craigslist. Someone was looking for help to feed their pets. Figuring they were just going out of town for a while, I responded to the ad, left my number, and shortly afterward got a phone call. The caller was a man who explained he was moving out of town, and his elderly parents needed someone to feed their cats daily. He asked for my name so he could do a quick background check, and about 20 minutes later he called back saying I was hired. I went there the next morning to go over instructions and meet him in person. His name was Luke. Luke explained that he could no longer care for his parents' 4 cats, and that his parents had other things they needed to focus on, so I was hired to take on the responsibility. He assured me the pay would be left for me on the kitchen table at the end of every week. Take note, $200 just to feed the cats. There would also be money left if more cat food was needed. Then he told me the first unusual instruction. I was to arrive exactly at 10 a.m. every day and be gone by 10:10 a.m. Under no circumstances was I to interact with his parents. He added that, during my visits, they'd be seated in the living room watching television and that I should not disturb them. I assured him that none of this was a problem. He showed me where the cats ate and where the food was stored. He also firmly reiterated that I shouldn't wander further in the house. He pointed out a spare keys hiding spot outside, in case the door was ever locked. Luke shook my hand, emphasized his trust in me, and reminded me to call if I couldn't make it one day, leaving me their home number. I left and went home to prepare for the routine. The next day, I arrived right at 10 a.m. I walked in and greeted Luke's parents, who were seated in recliners. They looked very focused on a game show, and I went straight to the kitchen to feed the cats. The parents didn't acknowledge my greeting at all, so I just did my job and left. This exact pattern repeated every day for several months. I come in and greet them, and then I'd feed the cats and leave with no interaction. Every Friday, I'd pick up a neat pile of cash on the kitchen table. It was without question the easiest job I'd ever had. But one day, I ran a few minutes late and arrived at 10:08 a.m. I apologized to his parents for being late, but they stayed silent, just staring at the television. I quickly fed the cats and checked my phone. It's 10:11 a.m. I turned toward the front door and nearly jumped out of my skin. Luke's parents were standing in the dim light behind their chairs, just staring at me. I mumbled another apology and rushed out, unsettled but committed to returning the next day on time. Several months passed with no further incidents, until one particular day when I arrived at 10:03 a.m. I was not too worried since I could finish by 10:10. However, as I was preparing the food, I heard a faint whispered plea for help. That startled me, prompting me to look around, but I saw no one. The voice whispered again and then a third time. I felt a chill but checked my phone. It was already 10:10. Heart pounding, I glanced down the hall to see Luke's parents for the first time in full light. They looked incredibly frail, almost skeletal, and their skin was alarmingly pale. I quickly apologized and said that I'd be leaving, but they remained still. They were blocking my way to the front door. I said I'd take the kitchen's back door instead, only to discover it required a key to open from the inside. A feeling of real panic set in. I looked behind me to see the parents now just outside the kitchen entrance. They were staring with blank, empty eyes. With nowhere else to go, I tried what I assumed was a pantry door, but it revealed a staircase leading down to a dark basement. As soon as I opened the door, a foul odor wafted up. I carefully descended, hoping for a window. Each one I found was nailed shut. Looking back up, I saw the parents standing at the top of the stairs, and I felt a surge of terror. I dialed emergency services and tried to explain the bizarre situation. They told me to stay on the line while they dispatched help. Using my phone as a dim flashlight, I navigated through rows of cluttered shelves in the basement. I was still hoping to find an exit. Suddenly, as I turned around, the light revealed Luke's parents standing just a few feet away from me. I stumbled back and tripped, losing hold of my phone. It landed screen down on the floor. I scrambled back up the stairs into the kitchen, glancing back to see them at the base of the stairs, with slight, chilling smiles on their faces. I sprinted down the hall to the front door and burst it open, screaming in relief when I saw an officer standing outside. He asked if I was the caller as I pushed past him, explaining that the people inside had trapped me and chased me around the house. The officer went in to investigate while I waited in the safety of the patrol car. When he returned, he asked if I was certain I had been chased by two old people. Then I asked about the smell in the basement, and he told me they had discovered a body down there. A second officer arrived and I gave my statement, explaining how I'd been coming to feed the cats every day for months and suggested they call Luke, the homeowner's son. When they tried the number he'd given me, it was disconnected. A few days later, I learned that the body in the basement was Luke himself. The whole experience left me with one question. If Luke was gone, who had been paying me? I'm definitely not taking a job from Craigslist again. The story began in the summer of 2015, just after I turned 25. Fresh out of graduate school, I was back in Oregon living in my childhood home with my mom and our family dog. My days were spent looking for jobs online in the mornings, sending out resumes and cover letters, and then heading to a nearby park for an afternoon workout. Keeping to this routine felt productive and kept me on track. Our neighborhood is in a relatively affluent part of a mid-sized city. It had no sidewalks, so walks or jogs around the block were out of the question. I had a mild grass allergy that was triggered at a local park just a 5-minute drive away, so most days I'd make the longer trip to a larger park about 20 minutes from my house. It was in a slightly rougher part of town, but it offered a nice jogging track and peaceful scenery, including a lake and plenty of birds. I stuck to this routine every weekday, taking weekends off to rest. Since my visits were during weekday afternoons in the summer, The park was mostly filled with retirees, parents with young children, and teenagers on summer break. Although I usually went around the same time, I never really noticed anyone in particular. The park was big enough that the jogging path around the lake was uncrowded, and I felt comfortable there, despite the neighborhood's reputation. I'd learned from family members in law enforcement to be aware of my surroundings. I also took note of anything unusual, but in those days, nothing about the park or the people in it set off any alarms. I'd stick to my workout, keep to myself, and head home. One Saturday, I was browsing the missed connections section of Craigslist just for fun. One post caught my eye. It was entitled, "I have to tell the woman I see walking." The post location matched the area where my regular park was located. The text was full of spelling and grammar errors, but the writer described someone who sounded a lot like me. The description matched the workout clothes, my general appearance, and even the sunglasses and sneakers I wore. He mentioned wanting to know more about her and feeling some kind of connection. I was unsettled by the detail in his description, but found myself curious about who could have written it and how he'd taken such detailed notes on me without me ever noticing. Curiosity got the best of me, so I created a throwaway email account and responded to the post. I wasn't really expecting a response, so I was shocked when one came through almost immediately. I asked a few questions to verify if he really meant the same park and who he was. Part of me still wondered if it was some kind of prank. His response was immediate and specific. He confirmed the location and identified himself as Mark. Then he did something that turned my unease into alarm. He attached about 7 photos of me walking and jogging in the park, taken over several months. These were classic stalker shots, blurry and clearly snapped on a phone. He ended the email asking if it was me. I felt my heart race, but I knew I had to stay calm. I kept a cool head, reminding myself of the investigative techniques I'd picked up from true crime shows. I decided to gather as much information about him as possible without giving anything away. I didn't confirm or deny that I was the person in the photos and pressed him for details about himself. He described himself as a 35-year-old, ex-military, around 6 feet tall. He said he had dark brown hair, tan skin, and a few distinctive tattoos. He claimed to work in a nearby office and often walked his dog there during lunch breaks. He even added that he was certain I would recognize him if I saw him, as he'd slowed down his own run more than once to look at me. I tried to recall if I'd ever seen anyone who matched this description, but I couldn't picture anyone specific. I decided to ask for a photo of his face, and about 30 minutes later, I received 3 images in response. The photos didn't match each other, and none of them looked like the person he'd described. A reverse image search confirmed they were lifted from social media or other websites. 2 were random men, and the third was an image taken from a memorial page of a deceased ex-military man. When I called him out on the fake photos, he dodged the accusation and instead sent me his phone number. He told me to call so he could explain. Now, I had another piece of information. Adrenaline was keeping me sharp, so I Googled the phone number. This led me to his full name, age, and address. His real name was Mark, but he was actually 45 and not 35. He also lived with his parents a few blocks from the park. Despite a lack of any criminal record, everything I'd learned by now painted a very disturbing picture. Against my better judgment, I decided to call him from my home phone using a blocked number. He answered, and I could tell instantly that he was older than he claimed. He admitted to being 45 after a bit of prodding, saying he'd wanted to seem younger. I questioned Mark about the fake photos. He then concocted a story about 2 of them being friends and the third being his late brother. His real last name didn't match the deceased military man's, and several other details didn't align. Finally, he sent a real photo of himself, showing a middle-aged and slightly overweight man with an unkempt appearance. He began boasting about his lifestyle, his wealth, his cars, and his properties. But then the conversation took an unsettling turn. He started making comments about how much he enjoyed watching women work out in tight clothing. Feeling uncomfortable, I made an excuse to get off the phone. I was determined to avoid him in the future. Later that day, I told the entire story to my close friend Aaron. He's an attorney and like an older brother to me, He was just as unnerved and suggested we go together to a Mexican bar and grill where Mark had mentioned he'd be meeting friends. It was near Aaron's place and the area was usually busy on weekend nights, so we felt relatively safe. I decided to let Aaron go inside alone to scope things out. I waited in his car around the corner while nervously checking my messages. After about half an hour, Aaron returned and he's looking shaken. We drove around for a bit and then he told me what had happened. Inside the restaurant, Aaron had taken a seat at the bar and ordered a drink. He was keeping an eye out for anyone resembling the photo I'd shown him. Not long after, a man who fit Mark's general description sat beside him and started a conversation. This behavior was unusual as strangers in the city rarely struck up conversations with each other. The man matched the real photo Mark had sent. He then began talking about his possessions, cars, and houses, just as he had with me on the phone. Then the conversation took a dark turn as the man grew visibly agitated. He proceeded to rant about how he couldn't meet any decent women. Given his experience with mental illness within his own family, Aaron said he could immediately tell this man was disturbed. At some point, Mark started ranting about watching women and how things would only progress when he took things into his own hands. Aaron knew it was time to leave, so he calmly finished his drink, paid his tab, and stood up to leave. As Aaron prepared to walk out, Mark leaned in close and said in a chillingly calm tone that I would find him waiting for me at the park on Monday. Mark had never been given any of my personal details, and Aaron had never mentioned me. Somehow, Mark knew I was Aaron's friend. This revelation left me horrified. After this, I stopped going to the park. I ignored all further emails from him, which alternated between pleas, anger, and inappropriate messages. I avoided going to the police, figuring he didn't have any real information about me and that he would lose interest eventually. I was cautious and made sure to keep my real identity hidden. Months passed. I changed my phone number and shared it only with family and close friends. But one day in late November, I received 5 blocked calls in rapid succession. Each left a voicemail. Playing the messages later, I was horrified to hear a man repeating lyrics to an inappropriate song in various accents. He was saying my name repeatedly and muttering threats. Then I received a 6th call. This time it's from an unblocked number. I Googled it and my worst fear was confirmed. It was Mark. To this day, I still don't know how he got my new number or found out my name. I suspect he might have overheard my name in a conversation at the park, but how he obtained my number remains a mystery. Since then, I've blocked his number and taken every precaution to keep my information private. About 2 years ago, I moved into a new apartment. The place had very thin walls, and due to fire safety regulations, my bedroom had only one window that looked into the living room instead of having direct outside access. That window ended up being more significant than I would have thought. It was a 3-bedroom apartment. There's one room for me, one for the main tenant, and a spare room that was rented out by a friendly guy at the time. He was pretty easygoing, but due to complications with his work visa, he had to move back to Canada unexpectedly. That gave us just about 2 weeks to find a replacement. Our best option was CRAIGSLIST, though I didn't participate in choosing our new roommate because of my work schedule. When the new person moved in, I was simply informed. At first glance, he seemed a bit odd, but overall friendly. He was a very tall, large guy and quiet. He's not really the type I'd go out of my way to hang out with, but we kept it cordial. After about 2 weeks, the main tenant left for an extended trip to Hawaii, which left the new roommate and me alone for the next month. The first few days were uneventful. Then, on the 4th day after my other roommate left, I was jolted awake around 8 a.m. There was frantic knocking on my door. My new roommate, who I'll call Kyle, was standing there looking agitated. He demanded to know what had happened the night before. I was confused, having come home from work around 9 p.m. the previous evening and gone straight to bed after a quick shower. I told him this, but he insisted he'd heard me arguing with someone in my room. He claimed to have seen me outside in the alley, arguing with the landlord. I hadn't even met the person yet at the time. He also said he heard people coming in and out of the apartment. I explained again that none of that had happened. He stared at me for a few seconds before walking away without another word. The same thing happened the next morning. This time, he told me he had seen me arguing with my boyfriend, but I was single. He also said I was talking loudly with our other roommate, who was away in Hawaii. He even asked for the badge number of the police officer I supposedly talked to the night before. This was too much, and I told him firmly that I had no idea what he was talking about. Kyle got a strange look and mumbled something about possibly having had a seizure in his sleep. He suggested that if it happened again, I should call an ambulance. He left my room briefly, but then came back an hour later and repeated the same story word for word. It happened once more after that, and I finally told him to leave me alone before heading out for work. That night, I returned to the apartment reluctantly, too exhausted to find an alternative place to stay. Turned out to be a mistake. Around 1 a.m., I was woken by slamming doors. Kyle was pacing back and forth from his bedroom to the living room, going outside and coming back in. He was flipping the lights on and off, mumbling angrily, and slamming doors. I could see his shadow moving past the frosted window that connected my room to the living room, though thankfully he couldn't see inside my darkened room. Suddenly, he screamed, demanding to know why I was making his life miserable. At first, I thought he was on the phone, so I stayed quiet. Moments later, he yelled my name, and it became clear that his outburst was directed at me. My heart raced as I began packing a bag quietly, preparing to leave. I was nearly ready when he shouted that he could hear me and charged at my door, slapping the wall right beside it without actually opening it. I held my breath as he pressed his ear to the window, his shadow leaning in close. I remained absolutely still. Eventually, he shouted my name once more and then resumed pacing. My shoes were outside my door, meaning I'd need a moment to slip them on when I made my escape. I decided to wait until he went back out the front door so I could grab my shoes, put them on, and run. As I was planning this, he stopped pacing. Kyle then yelled, challenging me to come out and fight him. Being a 5-foot woman, I had no interest in doing so. He turned off the lights after a few minutes and entered his room, leaving me with silence. I waited until I felt sure he wasn't moving, then decided it was my chance. I took a deep breath, opened my door, and stepped out to grab my shoes. When I looked up, he was standing there, barely dressed in the dark hallway. His arms were hanging at odd angles. He said in a disturbingly calm voice that we needed to talk. That was my cue to leave. I grabbed my shoes and ran out the door, sprinting about half a block barefoot before stopping to put them on. Looking back, I saw him standing in the porch light, watching me but not following. Fortunately, a friend of mine lived just a couple of blocks away and I had their spare key. I let myself in and stayed there for the night. For the next week, I camped out at my friend's place while we arranged with the main tenant for Kyle to move out. He claimed he didn't remember anything and wasn't sure if it had been real, but he acknowledged that it must have happened if I said so. On the day he moved out, he sent a text with a photo of the keys on the table, saying only that he was out. I took a friend to check the place, ensuring he had really left. Once inside, we found he'd left behind a lot of food and furniture. Strangely, he'd also ripped all the fire alarms from the ceiling and removed the front door's deadbolt. He had neatly placed this on the table. We realized then that the door could only lock from the outside with a key, meaning he might still have a copy. We called a locksmith immediately. Even after changing the locks, I was uneasy staying alone. I began barricading my door with furniture every night before bed. I still worry about his mental health as he was clearly unwell. Still, I can't help but wonder what might have happened had I not been as fortunate as I was. It was the summer of 2015 when I moved into a house I found on Craigslist. At first glance, my housemate and landlord seemed mostly normal, just a bit socially awkward and slightly dysfunctional. Let's call him Dan. As I signed the lease, Dan made a point of telling me that I should never go into the basement. It struck me as odd, but since I really needed a place to live, I brushed it off as one of those quirks some people have. As we lived together, I started noticing that Dan was more troubled than I initially thought. I realized that he used drugs, which didn't automatically worry me. However, I was surprised at how much he was using while still holding a steady job and maintaining a decent level of success. His behavior under the influence was the disturbing part. When he was home, drinking and using, he would talk incessantly. At times, he'd joke that if I ever smelled strange chemicals coming from the basement, I should ignore it. I thought it was odd and asked him why he kept mentioning it. He responded with a grin, saying that he used chemicals to clean up after bodies. I tried to dismiss it as a bad joke, but his expression made me uneasy. Dan also insisted on knowing my schedule, and I could tell he didn't like surprises. I took an unexpected day off once, and he seemed visibly startled and tense that I was home. That day, I heard loud clanging and muffled sounds coming from the basement while his car was still in the driveway. On other occasions, he'd play loud music or blare talk radio, filling the house with noise. In hindsight, I wonder if he was covering up other sounds. He often made unsettling comments about women and specifically about sex workers. He implied that you could get away with anything because no one would care. This disturbed me deeply, and I told him it was wrong. Despite my objections, he'd keep circling back to violent ideas, claiming he was the last person anyone would suspect. After all, he was an average guy with a house and a stable job. At that point, I started wondering if his comments went beyond just bad jokes. Then, one day while I was doing laundry, I caught a faint but unmistakable smell of decomposition. Growing up in a rural area, I knew that sometimes animals could get trapped and die in walls, but this smell came from the garage. I doubt there had been animals there. It didn't sit right with me, so I decided to confront him indirectly. Half-jokingly, I mentioned that he needed to do a better job cleaning up the bodies because I could smell it. His reaction was unforgettable. He looked at me with a mix of fear and anger, and after a moment, awkwardly thanked me before going into his room and closing the door. A few days later, he went into the crawl space in the garage and tried convincing me to join him up there. Something in me froze, and I had a gut feeling that if I went, I wouldn't be coming back. I made an excuse, grabbed my things, and left. Dan spent a lot of time in the basement, which was padlocked and had no interior door handle. Its only entrance was from the backyard. Part of me wished I'd looked down there to confirm or dispel my growing suspicions. As time went on, his comments became more graphic, especially about women. His drug use also increased. There was also a time when he showed me a video he'd made that featured unsettling themes. The footage included a distorted soundtrack of screams and a figure in a dark costume. Each new thing I learned about him added to my discomfort. By October 2016, I'd had enough. I left without notice and headed to a protest camp to get away. It was partly because I felt called to be there, but it's mostly because I wanted to escape that house. The night before I left, he was under the influence again. As usual, the conversation returned to the same morbid topics. I finally told him that he'd be caught eventually. He responded calmly, assuring me that the police would never suspect him. For months and then years, the experience haunted me. Eventually, I called Crime Stoppers in Portland and gave an anonymous tip describing everything I'd observed. The operator put me on hold several times as the sergeant on duty seemed very interested. They asked detailed questions about his car, the house, and the disturbing things Dan said. I shared everything I remembered, hoping I'd done the right thing. I shared this story with my mother recently, and she looked up the house on Google Maps. We noticed a large, enclosed trailer in the driveway, something that hadn't been there when I lived with him. I couldn't help but wonder about its purpose, though I knew my suspicions were only theories. Unless he's eventually caught, I doubt I'll ever know the truth. I've been around rough people in my life, but none have ever left such a lasting impression on me. I lived with a roommate in this nice apartment we found on Craigslist. It's located in a scenic spot near the river in Charleston. My roommate covered most of the rent thanks to her parents' help, and she enjoyed the place as much as I did. Living a few floors above us, the landlord seemed like a sweet couple with children. I thought it was the perfect setup. The first few weeks passed normally, though their kids would often shout at me whenever they saw me in the elevator before darting out as fast as they could. Initially, I found it a bit amusing and chalked it up to them just being quirky. But then, the couple's older son joined it. His howling at me somehow didn't feel right because he appeared close to my age. I assumed he was just trying to have fun with his younger siblings. Things started to feel off after a strange encounter with the family. We chatted for a while, and in the middle of a pleasant conversation, the father suddenly apologized. He said his son might seem a bit odd because he's stupid and got a few screws loose. Well, he used much harsher words and seemed to chuckle while saying it. I was taken aback. His comment seemed so out of place and abrupt. I can't recall what I replied, but I do remember feeling uneasy and wanting to leave as soon as possible. I ran into the dad again a few days later, this time in the elevator. I kept my distance, but he started talking about how fantastic my apartment was. He also mentioned how generous he'd been in offering it at such a low rate. Then out of nowhere, he asked if I could babysit his kids for the evening. He said that he had a dinner engagement with his wife and oldest son. I declined initially, but he countered with an offer of $150 per hour. Against my better judgment, I agreed because I thought that would be easy money. Looking back, that was definitely a mistake. Arriving at their apartment left me awestruck. It occupied an entire floor and was easily the most luxurious place I'd ever seen. Things went smoothly for about an hour as I played video games with the kids, until suddenly, the front door slammed shut. I told the kids to stay put and went to investigate. There, stumbling in and clearly intoxicated, was the dad. He staggered towards me before collapsing onto the couch at the last second. I barely held back a laugh, watching him sprawled out on the sofa. When I tried to help him up, he looked at me and mumbled something about his wife being okay with it. Before I could even figure out what he meant, his wife came in. She thanked and paid me and said I should come back sometime. I returned to my apartment in disbelief, wondering what had just happened. I talked about it with my roommate a little later, and she mentioned that she too had run into the dad. The man had said something cryptic about his wife being cool with it before wandering off without any explanation. We both agreed right then that we wouldn't be renewing our lease. We didn't see the landlords for a while, but they showed up again as our lease approached its final month. I joked with friends about how bizarrely awkward they were, and the next encounter proved it. My boyfriend and I ended up sharing an elevator with them one day. They fell silent, nodding and smiling as if everything was normal, but the tension was intense. The dad called out to us as the doors closed, winking in a way that made my skin crawl. After that, I asked my boyfriend to stay with us for the rest of the lease. My roommate and I were too uneasy to feel comfortable alone. The creepiest experience happened just days before our move-out date. My roommate stepped out of our apartment and found the landlords sitting by the elevators as if waiting for us. They burst into tears and begged her to stay, saying they were sorry for making us uncomfortable. They claimed they thought we were the perfect young women they'd been looking for. My roommate stayed silent, got into the elevator, and called to warn me they were outside. When they knocked on our door, my boyfriend answered. The husband asked if I was around, but my boyfriend told him I wasn't. That's when they insisted to step inside to check. I decided to show myself, threatening to call the police if they didn't leave immediately. They finally backed off, rushing out of the apartment. Just a few days later, a message came through from an unknown number. It's offering us 6 months of free rent if we'd be willing to spend a few nights there. We blocked and deleted the number without a second thought. The whole ordeal was beyond unsettling, especially knowing they held keys to our place. I was completely broke, honestly. There's no other way to put it. I'd just been kicked out of my mom's place, which, fair enough, I was 25 and without a job. I was pretty desperate to find some cash. I didn't want to be stuck in some minimum wage job forever, just scraping by. I wanted something more than just barely getting by. Looking back, I probably should have started small and worked my way up like most people do, but I decided to try freelancing instead. It seemed promising, good pay, and the freedom to choose my own gigs. I felt confident I could make enough to eventually pursue some education beyond a high school diploma. And where did I think to start? CRAIGSLIST. Not the best idea, but I did it anyway. Late one night, I was scrolling through the job section on CRAIGSLIST and came across an ad for help on a farm. It offered housing, free meals, and, most importantly, decent pay. The ad mentioned an older man who'd inherited a farm but was getting too old to manage it all alone. The compensation sounded great, and with rent covered, it seemed ideal. After debating with myself for a couple of hours, I finally sent him an email. I explained I only needed temporary work since I was saving for school and assured him I could be reliable for 6 months. I didn't expect a response, thinking he might be looking for something more long-term. But surprisingly, I got a reply just 15 minutes later. I'd sent that email around 2 a.m. I'll admit, his quick response felt a bit strange, especially since it was the middle of the night. But he got straight to the point, saying any help was appreciated, and he'd be ready for me the following day. He included an address and his phone number. The next morning, I packed up, told my mom about the job, and headed to the farm. When I arrived, he looked nothing like I'd pictured. He was tall and quite overweight, with a beard that was patchy but still a beard, I suppose. His eyes were deep and dark. They were so dark I could hardly see his pupils. When I approached with my bags, he reached out his hand. Our handshake wasn't particularly warm. It was firm, almost too much so, and felt like it lingered a bit too long. After that, he motioned for me to hurry inside, so I did. He showed me to my room quickly and asked if I could start right away. A bit flustered, I dropped my belongings and changed into jeans and old shoes. I headed to the main hall where he stood, looking almost like a statue. When our eyes met, he began listing off my tasks. He wanted me to tend to the field 3 times a day. He mentioned he'd replowed the land to start fresh, intending to grow corn to sell to local stores. When I asked about the animals, he said there were none and cut me off before I could ask anything else, handing me a shovel instead. He instructed me to fill in holes across the farm before he could till the land. Feeling awkward, I took the shovel and went outside. His gaze was uncomfortable to endure. The farm was massive. At the far end of the field, the house was no longer visible. I know because I had to walk all the way there, looking for these holes. But I didn't find any until I was near the edge of the farm. The area was encircled by dense forest. I knew it was rural, but I didn't realize how secluded it really was. A true one-way in, one-way out sort of place. The forest was thick, so easy to get lost in if you weren't careful. When I reached the very end of the field, I saw only one hole and several others that looked freshly filled in. It seemed odd that he'd send me all the way out here to fill just one hole. As I started to shovel dirt into it, my curiosity got the best of me. I began digging into one of the recently filled holes. These weren't small holes. They were wide and about 12 feet long, big enough to bury a large animal. I assumed that's what they were, for since he'd said there weren't any animals. I felt uneasy but pressed on. It didn't take much digging to uncover the first disturbing find. An empty wallet. I tossed it aside and kept going. Then, I noticed a piece of red fabric buried a few feet down. I couldn't tell what it was at first, hoping it was just an animal wrapped in cloth. But denial could only go so far. About 4 feet down, I found a body. It was a young woman, her condition bad but with little decomposition. The trauma she'd experienced was visible, and her body felt cold to the touch. I knelt beside her, shocked, before the realization hit me that her death had occurred recently. I stumbled to a nearby tree and vomited. I didn't fill in the hole I was supposed to, but I reburied her, not wanting her to be exposed. I tossed the wallet toward the edge of the woods, thinking the police would find it later if he tried to conceal the bodies. Then I ran, adrenaline fueling my escape. It was nearly dark, and the thought of being hunted terrified me. I was sure he intended to leave me out there until nightfall. When I reached the house, I took a moment to calm my breathing and keep a neutral expression. Entering, I saw him seated at the dining table. When he heard the door, his head whipped around, eyes wide in surprise. Trying to appear casual, I mentioned that I'd gotten sick and needed to come back but would return to finish. He gave me a scrutinizing look before reluctantly agreeing, instructing me to get it done by nightfall. Back in my room, I quietly packed, but my keys were missing. I immediately suspected he'd taken them. My plan had been to grab my things and escape, but that seemed impossible without my keys. As panic set in, I scrolled through photos on my phone, hoping to distract myself, until I came across one from my 23rd birthday. A picture of me with my new car and 2 sets of keys in my hands. I remembered my spare keys, always tucked in my suitcase. Frantically, I dug through my bag and found them. Abandoning my clothes, I hid my phone and keys in my pants, then left the room pretending to head back out. I pretended to feel sick again in the bathroom, making retching sounds to buy time. When I was done, he nodded for me to return to the field. I walked slowly, glancing back to see him watching from the window. As soon as he turned away, I sprinted to my car. Hearing my footsteps, he ran outside just as I got in the car. I floored it, and in my rear view, I saw him running toward me. 2 gunshots rang out, one piercing the passenger seat, but I kept driving. I made it back to my mom's and immediately told her everything. When I reported it to the authorities, they found over 50 bodies on the farmland. Cold cases from years prior were now getting answers. The only thing they didn't find was him. I still check for news every few months, but nothing has come up. He'd used a fake name and a burner phone, and I hadn't taken any photos. All I had was a sketch based on my description. This happened about 10 years ago now. I was a college student, and I was basically forced to move out on my own, which I didn't mind, but that meant finding a new roommate, which can be a daunting and scary experience. I've had a few weird encounters, but I think this one takes the cake. I posted on Craigslist looking for a bedroom in a shared house or apartment for $300 or less. And on my ad I mentioned, please no phone calls, only texts or email. I find being on the phone with someone I haven't had a chance to size up a really uncomfortable situation. I'm just awkward, I guess. Anyway, I got a call from a dude who clearly didn't read the no calls part. This type of phone call was exactly the reason I don't like to talk to strangers on the phone. First, he was just pleasant and normal. He told me he had a room available and relevant information like that. We started to talk about when and where we'd meet, and he started going on tangents about random stuff. I'm a combination of too interested in deep conversation and too awkward to end the call when it started to get weird, so this call went on for 2 hours. We even talked about the meaning of life and all kinds of weird stuff. Honestly, this should have been the red flag, and I shouldn't have met him. Of course, I also should have grown a pair and told him I needed to leave. So, he wants me to meet him at his place and show me the room. I've since learned that you should really insist on meeting in public first. I got to his neighborhood, and it was run down on a level that made the ghetto I grew up in look nice. There were saggy front porches, hot cracked concrete, sad-looking people with old beat-up Lincolns. You get the picture. His house blended right in. The yard was seriously overgrown, and the front door didn't work. So, I went around the back, and just looking at the guy standing in the doorway and seeing the kitchen behind him was enough to make me realize I really just wanted to leave. There's no way in hell I'd like to live there. The guy in the doorway was a man with a sort of clown-style afro. He was leaning on a cane on his right side. His eyes looked crazy, and the house smelled musty from 10 feet away. Again, I'm a coward, so instead of trusting my gut, I go inside. I was thinking, it's okay. It will be over in 20 minutes and I can get the hell out. I don't know what made me think this. That's the man who had a 2-hour conversation with me on the phone about life and philosophy. He took me up a flight of creaky steps into a small bedroom with no door and a mattress on the floor. I thought no way in hell would I live with a 40-something man and no door on my bedroom. I'm female and 19 at the time, by the way. Anyways, it was a moot point because my mind was made up before I even saw the room. I wouldn't have lived there for free, let alone for $200 a month. Things got weird. He tried to hold me hostage with conversation again. I think he was lonely. He talked about how some of his family were millionaires. He might have been delusional, and the whole story seemed made up. Then, he told me about an 18-year-old girl that has also checked out the room and tried to have sex with him, and told me about how his mom hated white people. He was black, I was white, and it sounded like he sympathized with her. Obviously, that was super uncomfortable. Eventually, I was able to find a break in the conversation and plucked up the courage to make up an excuse to leave. I was never so happy to leave a place in my life. I don't know that he necessarily intended harm or anything, but he really gave me the creeps. I was living in Hawaii and had to move to LA for work. I didn't know anyone, was fairly broke, and my job wasn't going to help with moving expenses. So, I resorted to scouring CRAIGSLIST for a room for rent. After literally hundreds of scams or weirdos, I finally found this amazing girl. She was funny, we had similar interests, and she even worked in the same field as me. She didn't yet have a place, but she and another girl were looking at several houses that required a third roommate. They were totally fine with doing all the work, seeing as how I was an ocean away. She called or Skyped with me about once a week and sent me pictures of each house they looked at. All in all, she was incredible. Fast forward 3 months, they found a huge and gorgeous house. Everything was settled, and the two girls, Evan and Juliana, were moved in. Evan, the original girl from CRAIGSLIST, picked me and all my stuff up at the airport. On the ride home, she starts telling me horror stories about her past roommates. Every single one had messed her over in some horrendous way, and she was terrified of being close to people after that. She said she wanted us to be the people who turned that around for her, that she wanted us to be a little family. Evan then drove us not to the house but to a nearby Starbucks where she chain smoked. She then told me about her stepdad who was in AA and how she'd briefly been attending meetings after a short bout with painkiller addiction. Then, she had decided she wasn't a drug addict and didn't need it. She also admits that she's only known the other roommate for a month and a half. I'm seeing red flags all over the place. Why would an LA native need to find strangers to live with her on CRAIGSLIST? Why was she oversharing about drugs and family? Why had she never had a positive roommate experience? I pushed it all aside, giving this girl the benefit of the doubt. A few weeks go by in the house and all is well. I forget she ever seemed off and we start becoming close. Then, she takes me on a tour of LA for a day and proceeds to tell me her entire disturbing life story. When I say we had gotten close, by no means were we close enough to make this appropriate. She tells me about her stepfather who molested her. She got sent to a mental hospital when she told on him because he's a doctor and said she was criminally insane. She got abused by a lesbian at the hospital and beaten by the guards, and shortly attempted to overdose. I learned about her mother's severe narcotic addiction, her ex-fiancé having a psychotic break and trying to kill her. It didn't stop there. Evan told me about her struggles with a chronic kidney illness that required many surgeries and her recent long-term boyfriend disappearing under mysterious circumstances. The horrific stories just went on and on and on. It sounded like something from a movie, and a part of me questioned if it could all possibly be true. But again, I give her the benefit of the doubt. Again, things go fine for a while, and my doubts about her subside. Then, my food starts disappearing. I ask both girls about it privately, and Evan claims that the other girl, Juliana, had confessed to her that she was a compulsive overeater. Naturally, Juliana claims to be innocent. I side with Evan, and we start mildly bullying Juliana to try to get her to admit to stealing the food. Then, dishes start piling up in the sink and nobody is washing them except me. I ask both girls, and again Evan swears on her life that it's Jules. Finally, Jules has had enough. Turns out she's been eating out every meal. We all had extremely different schedules. Evan lied to my face about the dishes and the food. When confronted, Evan starts crying and saying how I could accuse her. She keeps on weeping and repeating that she's a good person, and we end up apologizing to her in the end. Finally, the tension builds between the two girls due to many repeats of this situation. One night, when I'm at work, they start fighting. Evan calls me saying Juliana hit her and she's afraid for her life. I call Jules and tell her to find a new place to live. Juliana goes to stay with friends, and within a week moves out. Now things get really weird. Evan moves out of the master bedroom and starts sleeping in the living room every night. After I repeatedly request that she return to living in her bedroom, she tearfully confesses that she's been on high-dose opiates this whole time and is trying to wean herself off. It makes her too weak to walk downstairs to her room. Feeling sorry for her, I end up babysitting her for weeks while she withdraws. It was both terrifying and disgusting, but I wanted to help her out. During this time, I see her naked and realize that she has no scars from her supposedly repeated surgeries. Beyond that, she confides in me that she hasn't been working at all this entire time, but going out to score drugs and get high every day, and now she's flat broke. She apologizes for lying, saying over and over that she's a sick addict and just needs help. I get her into AA and NA as soon as she's able to walk, driving her daily to meetings and holding her hand the whole time. My longtime boyfriend and her oldest friend move in with us a short while later to help with bills. That's when it all goes from bad to unbearable. Evan goes to visit her mom one night and disappears for a week, returning very clearly high and claiming to be sober. She then starts going on many trips to visit friends in other states and is rarely home. When she is home, she babbles endlessly about how great sobriety is and how she's finally healing, while clearly nodding out on opiates. I end up finding something suspicious on her computer. She admits to me that she's been working as a call girl and bringing customers to the house. I tell her she has to stop, and she claims she already has. Around this time, she becomes very, very physically ill. Finally, I get a phone call from her after another absence. She's hysterical. She's, get this, 6 months pregnant. She didn't know because she was so high. The baby was severely malformed and there was no way of carrying to term. I comforted her, thinking that this trauma outweighed all the weird behaviors she exhibited. She had the procedure and afterwards disappeared for almost a month. I thought at one point that she was dead until she texted me asking if her cat was okay. When she returned, she proceeded to start eating all of our food, using all of our toiletries, sleeping on the couch and smoking inside the house, which was not okay with us at all. She was also very clearly on drugs. At first, we tried to be nice about it, but she lied and lied, even going so far as to say her room was haunted and the ghost made her sleep upstairs. Finally, my boyfriend snaps and yells at her. She calls the cops and claims he assaulted her. They didn't believe her, but the other roommate did. Then one night, when I'm at work, she uses pity and sweet-talking to convince my BF that we should all be friends again. I told him it was a lie and he didn't believe me. When I get home from work that same night, my room is trashed. I asked if he did it, and of course he didn't. She'd been in there looking for cash or drugs, which I don't do. When I asked her about it, she looked me straight in the eyes and said, it was the ghost. After that, she started sending me insane emails claiming that I had been her best friend and had betrayed her, accusing her of heinous crimes and even convincing her she was a drug addict as a form of sick psychological torture. The emails get increasingly intense, becoming 10 to 20-page letters about how she didn't feel safe in her own home and how I was the embodiment of pure evil. She said that my only purpose in life was to torment her. In these emails, she claimed that she used drugs on rare occasions, and that I had made up everything about her problem, that I had been verbally abusive about her abortion, and that we had repeatedly physically assaulted her. We were genuinely afraid for our safety, especially after the police showed up one day and took her in for a mysterious psychiatric hold. We never found out why she was carried out of the house, barefoot and handcuffed, by 4 officers. After that, we just tried to avoid her, but she got the other roommate involved. She even went too far as to claim she had pneumonia from the stress of living with us and our constant abuse. The emails continued to escalate. At one point, she said that I had been a sister to her until the evil spirit in me had forced me to abuse her. This was when I realized that her definition of abuse was a bit skewed, and all her stories about her childhood, exes, old roommates, and even Juliana had been complete fabrications. Of course, she didn't have scars from the surgeries. Everything she said was a lie to garner sympathy so she could take advantage of people. Now I realized, of course, that she was completely mad. We found a new house, and the night before moving out, I hacked into her email. I come to find out she had been telling our landlord that we were heinous criminals, telling her parents that she had been fired from a job because of me and needed money. There were all kinds of lies. Also, we come to find out that the guy who got her pregnant didn't mysteriously disappear. He ran away because they slept together once, and she started stalking him. Obviously, everything she had ever said was a creepy lie. After moving out, the harassing emails and texts continued to the point that I had to have her blocked on both and seriously considered getting a restraining order. This was many years ago. Recently, we found out that this girl who claimed to have never been a drug addict and that I made all of it up had died of an overdose. She was evil. This wasn't a situation where nobody tried to help a sick person. Everyone around her tried to help her, and she manipulated and used them. I don't feel sad that she's gone. In fact, I still want to punch her in the face.